There's something wet, born from rain and snow, that starts out high and then begins to flow. Hang on, we'll see where this water goes. On its voyage to the river, water turns to song in Missoula's urban wetlands. Missoula benefits from two low spots of high interest: Bancroft Pond and Cattail Corner. Bancroft Pond is excavated and partly wooded, several acres large. Cattail Corner is open and half the size. Both wetlands are closely bounded by the city of Missoula. Nevertheless, the full spectrum of ecological life finds refuge in our urban wetlands.
There are lots of different kinds of wetlands, and the wetland that we have here is sort of like an inland marsh, okay? And you can see all the cattails typically growing in a wetland marsh. How about you tell everybody about that, okay? And you can tell everybody that all wetlands, do you remember the three things they do? They provide habitat, which is food, water, and shelter. They also filter out pollution, and they soak up a lot of the rainwater.
Okay.
Can you guys remember that?
Yes, habitat, rain, and pollution. Okay.
Right, okay. I'm Wendy Ridenauer from the Montana Natural History Center, and I'm a plant and wetlands ecologist. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what a wetland is. In other words, what's the definition of a wetland? Wetlands require the presence of three different things in order to be considered wetlands. They need to have a wetland soil, wetland plants, and the presence of water, or hydrology. Wetlands hold a lot of the water that runs off of the ground, called runoff, stormwater runoff, after a rainstorm or when the snow is melting. And this is important because if we didn't have wetlands, all of that runoff would rush pretty much immediately into rivers and streams, causing really large-scale flooding events. Now, floods are important, but we don't want a really big flood every time it floods. So wetlands are holding this water, keeping it there for a while. They're also helping to control pollution that's in the runoff, things like fertilizer and pesticides that come from residential settings or golf courses, and things like oil and gasoline and other toxics that come off of parking lots like we have right over there. And these things have a chance then to settle out in the wetland as they sit there in the water, and some of the plants in the wetland actually uptake these materials, and some of them can even be broken down or metabolized by the plants. So the water then running off into the stream or the river after it passes through the wetland is cleaner, and wetlands will hold water well into the dry part of the year in August, so that they can slowly continue to release water even when there is no rainfall. Another really good thing. And then one of the most important things about wetlands is that they're fantastic habitat. About 80% of our North American animals have to use wetlands at some part of their life cycle. Wetlands only make up about 1% of our land area, so they're extremely important places. This is a great little urban wetland, and it provides these functions for the most part. So there are lots and lots of different types of wetlands, and this one is an inland marsh. It's dominated by herbaceous vegetation. In other words, we don't have a lot of shrubs, and we certainly don't have trees, so it's not a forested wetland. It's saturated by water and in fact inundated. A large portion of it is actually inundated by water the entire year and certainly through the entire growing season. There's actually a lot of diversity mixed in with the cattails, especially along the edges. A lot of sedges and rushes and other forbs. Bancroft Pond is a very similar habitat in that it's an isolated urban wetland. Just the fact that this area has been excavated out as a pond as opposed to a natural wetland that would have more of a gradation from imponded to saturated, you're just not going to get as much variety in a lot of the herbaceous plant species.
Hi, my name is Chris, and here we are at Bancroft Ponds in Missoula, and you can see the nice wetland here behind us with the cattails and the blackbirds, and there's ducks. But you know, all of this stuff that we can see at the surface is beautiful, but I'm a geologist, so I'm really interested in what happens underneath the surface, underground. How does this wetland work in terms of how does it store water for us? And what does it do for us? Well, this is where water comes into the wetland. This is Paddy Creek. You can see that it's kind of an engineered creek right here. It comes out of Paddy Canyon as a natural creek, but when it flows through neighborhoods, past houses and underneath roads, it ends up being a little bit more engineered. So it's a bit of a ditch while it comes into Bancroft wetlands. Once this water flows into the wetland, where does it go? Well, some of it soaks into the ground and it enters what we call the groundwater. In other words, it goes down to the water table and it flows through soil and gravel through the Missoula Valley, and eventually it ends up in the Bitterroot River. And Paddy Creek eventually ends up in the Bitterroot River too. It flows year-round, and so the wetland stays wet year-round. Of course, in the springtime, we tend to get more water, like there is now. There's a fair amount of water coming in. And later on in the summer, there will be less water, and the water level in the wetland will go down a little bit, but still there's water in the wetland year-round. This wetland that we're looking at is a beautiful wetland and great habitat for birds, but it fulfills another function too. Think about when it rains really hard, or think about when the snow melts. Where does all that water go? It goes into those drains that you see in the street. You might ask the question, well, where does that water go? Where does it end up? In Missoula, here's one place where it ends up. If you live in the South Hills, your stormwater comes out right here. And it comes out into the Bancroft ponds. And so the ponds do sort of double duty for us. These wetlands store and purify the stormwater runoff by slowing the water down so the sediment has a chance to fall out of the water. And the vegetation and the sediment that's left in the wetlands then filters any of the additional pollutants that might happen to be in that stormwater runoff. So Paddy Creek, which is the creek that comes out of Paddy Canyon, comes into the wetland, it slows down and spreads out in the wetland, and then it comes out the other side, again as a stream. So we can see that there's a lot of water at the surface, but that's not the only place where water flows. Water's also flowing underground. In fact, the wetland is acting like a giant sponge. So what does this sponge, or what does this wetland do for us? Well, a couple of things. First of all, it does slow down floodwater. So imagine if we have a big flood, we've got lots and lots of water coming into the wetland. The wetland slows all that water down, and so it spreads the flood out, and it comes out more slowly on the other end, so it helps decrease flooding. The other thing that it does is that it filters the water that comes into it. So if we have dirty water, say from runoff from the streets, if we've got dirt in yards and sand in driveways that are getting hosed down into those drains that you see in the streets, all of that comes out at the top of this wetland and it flows through this wetland. So when this dirty storm water comes into our wetland, which is our sponge, remember, the sponge filters all that dirty, gunky stuff out. And so we're left with cleaner water coming out the other end. So look at the dirty water going in and this much cleaner water coming out. And so all of that sand and sediment and other pollutants are held within the wetland, within the sponge. Okay, so the wetland acts like a filter. So just to review, what do wetlands do for us? They store floodwaters, they filter out pollutants, and the other thing they do is they recharge the water table. That water then replenishes streams further downhill.
A wetland soil has a special name. It's called a hydric soil. So the other one of you is going to tell everybody, see these little red lines where the roots were in the soil?
Okay.
You can tell this is a wetland or hydric soil because these little red areas around the roots are where the roots pumped oxygen out into the soil.
Okay, what is it called again?
A hydric
Hydric
soil.
soil.
Hydric relating to water, hydrology.
When soils become saturated with water, oxygen is moved out of the soil. When there's no more oxygen in the soil, we call that an anaerobic condition, lack of oxygen. When this happens, there's a chemical reaction that occurs in the soil that leaves behind specific color characteristics that we can see. The chemistry behind this would be kind of comparing a piece of iron machinery gets wet, and when it dries, rust forms on it. Rust is iron oxide. Soils, most soils have a lot of iron in the soil profile, and it's in the form of iron oxide. And it's kind of just spread around the soil. You can't really see any spots of rust in the soil. When the groundwater comes up and saturates near the surface, where you have a lot of microorganisms going, the oxygen is removed, both from the water pushing the air out and from the microorganisms using that air to breathe. When all of the oxygen is gone, you have an anaerobic condition. The iron in the soil is reduced. It goes from an oxidized state to a reduced state. And in this reduced state, iron is mobile. It's like dissolved in the soil. So you've got these iron atoms floating around in this soil water. The water table drops, or the ponding water on top goes down or runs off, or the floodwaters recede. Air comes back into the soil profile. As it starts to work its way in, the oxygen in that air attracts those iron atoms that are floating around, and it forms little rust spots in the soil. So what this means is, because the soils leave behind these color characteristics, you can go out in August and dig a hole in an area and determine if that soil is ever saturated at some time during the year. That cycle of the water going down eventually and then coming back up and staying that way actually strips all the iron out of that soil profile and leaves behind a gleyed soil color. And a gleyed soil color would be like gray, maybe a bluish or a greenish gray. When we talk about the different soil colors, soil scientists have even come up with their own coloring book. When we start talking about gleyed soils now, we're talking about colors that look like this. I have some samples here of some different types of soils. Let's start with the upland soils. This is a grassland soil. It has a darker colored surface. Grassland soils have a darker colored surface because they have more organic matter in the surface layer, and this is because most of the roots in a grass plant are near the surface. This particular soil is called Scoby clay loam and is our state soil. Probably didn't know that states have their own state soil, like the state tree and the state bird. Every state has a state soil. Let's look at some hydric soils, some wetland soils. Notice the colors down here. I guess with my eyes, I'm kind of looking at that as being kind of a gray with a little bit, maybe a green tint to it. This particular soil formed in an old, small glacial lake. On top of this silt down here, we have some organic layers. A lot of people think about peat bogs. Those are organic soils. This is like a peat bog. This is just decomposed organic matter, the types of vegetation that would grow in a wetland. This particular soil is another organic soil, except it's more than 6 feet deep before we'd hit the silts. These things started out as a pond, deep water, and as sediment came in, there's a little bit of soil, mineral soil in here, but you had this emergent vegetation growing, dying, not completely decomposing, but building up from the bottom up, these layers of peat. And pretty soon, it's just a nice big peat bog that might have some water on the surface in the spring of the year, but then it goes down. This is a mineral wetland soil, all mineral soil material above it as compared to the organic material in these. And in here, the lower part, you can see more of the gray colors. And this is where the soil stays saturated for longer periods in the year. As you come up towards the surface, you start to see more of these reddish brown spots. Those are those rust spots I was talking about earlier. Where the groundwater table would come up in the spring, it would stay up here maybe for 2-3 weeks, maybe a month, and then the groundwater starts to drop down, but it sits at this level for a longer period, maybe even throughout the growing season. The iron that formed the rust spots up here has been stripped out, removed, leached down now in this zone. The Bancroft ponds here are what we call artificial wetlands. These areas were diked up to block the water to create these wetlands. Natural wetland soils, hydric soils in nature, take many years to form those glade colors and the rust spots in them. This sample here, you can see it's still really wet. I dug it out of that flat area just behind, in front of me over here, and we don't see the reddish brown rust spots in here. The soil colors are just kind of a dark brown. I suspect part of the reason we don't see them here, besides the fact that this soil hasn't been through the saturation cycles for dozens and dozens of years, is that it's still relatively cold and a little too wet. The formation of these rust spots in the soil is a biochemical reaction. It needs the microbial part of it to occur along with the chemical reaction. And it's still too cold for those microorganisms to completely take the oxygen out of here to develop that anaerobic condition where the iron would become reduced and then float around in the soil. As the water level in these ponds go down and more air comes back into this soil, we should start to see some rust spots develop in here. You can usually tell an artificial wetland soil from a natural wetland soil by the matrix color of the soil staying this brown color, but still developing rust spots in it. If this was a natural hydric soil, this zone through here wouldn't be this dark brown color. It would be a light grayish brown color, maybe even a gray color. The organic matter in this soil is quite high. You can tell by the dark color on the surface. It's usually difficult to see those rust spots in a zone that has high organic matter in it. Over time, this area here, with these artificial wetlands, will develop those color patterns. This particular soil here will probably start to develop more rust modeling down here. I don't know how long it might take. There's still a lot of organic matter in here, and I still kind of think if we let this dry out completely, you'd start to see some faint rust spots in that soil. This is called texture by feel. Of course, we could send this sample into a lab. First thing we're going to try to estimate is the amount of clay that it has in it. When you have it into about the Play-Doh consistency, you take it between your thumb and your index finger and see if you can push it up like this, make a ribbon that stands up. If it stands up, you know you got a fair amount of clay in it. So you always have to remember that most all soils have some sand, silt, and clay in them. So this sample here doesn't have much clay in it. We can't make a ribbon, but it's holding together. We know it's got some clay in it. So we're going to say that this particular soil has 15% clay. And the way we analyze for sand is you take a little bit of it and you pour water over it and rub it really good. Try to kind of wash it down. So now you can start to feel the sand. It's fine sand. We actually separate sand into very fine sand, medium sand, coarse sand, and very coarse sand. So this particular soil, I would estimate to have in the neighborhood of probably 40 to 50% sand. Let's call it 45% sand, 15% clay, that adds up to 60. So the remainder, 40%, is silt. We can take this textural triangle here, and we say we have about 15% clay, so we come up the clay side between the 10 and the 20, and we come over, and we said 45% sand, so we come up, and where those intersect, that's what we're at. So this is a loam. So that's all soil by texture is, or soil texture by feel. So soil texture is real important. We have a nice loamy soil here. Look at the structure in there, the high organic matter, this nice like crumb structure. Structure is how the soil particles are clumped together. This nice crumb structure, we call it granular, allows air and water to move down in to the soil to get down to where most of the roots are. Soil has a tremendous capacity to filter out pollutants in the environment. It's nature's filter is what it is. A well-functioning wetland is able to trap pollutants, heavy metals included. If you have runoff into a wetland area and you have good turnover of organic material and the processes that occur in wetlands, those pollutants can actually be trapped in the soil itself and held there. The organic matter in soils and the clay in soils ties up a lot of the pollutants that might enter a wetland. In urban wetlands where you have a lot of use and a lot of people walking around the wetlands to look at the vegetation and enjoy the animals and the birds, you could get some soil compaction. When soils are moist or wet, they're more easily compacted than when they are dry, and generally soils around the edges of wetlands are wet. On the other side of the ponds over here, where people walk down to feed the ducks all the time, those soils would be highly compacted.
It's really important to have a lot of plants in any given area because they produce food,
Okay.
right? They're the
Okay.
base of the food web. Without plants, none of us would be here.
Okay. So
Good. Wetland plants are called hydrophytic vegetation, and they are plants that are either obligate, in other words, they absolutely have to grow in wetlands and waterlogged soil, or they tend to do best in wetland soil. So hydrophytic vegetation, these plants, like the cattails in back of us, are plants that are found predominantly on wetter sites, and we need a predominance of them in order for the area to be considered a wetland. Plants play many, many roles in a wetland. They stabilize the soil with their roots, and their root systems do prevent erosion to a certain extent. Plants also uptake a lot of the nutrient pollution, in other words, a lot of excessive fertilizer that's running off of golf courses and residential lawns, things like that. So they'll uptake this, they'll uptake and metabolize some of the other pollutants, even breaking them down. Plants do provide habitat value as well, food for animals. Countless species produce berries and seeds that birds and other animals eat, and of course, a lot of herbivores graze in wetlands. So many roles as our primary producers. The predominant vegetation here is the cattails, Typha latifolia. Even though they are forming a monoculture out here, they do provide some really important habitat. These red-winged blackbirds not only eat parts of the cattail, they build their nests down low in these cattail stems, so it's providing them excellent cover. Cattails also provide really important habitat for muskrats, and in fact there is a muskrat home in this wetland, and they make their homes out of cattail stems, just big piles of cattail stems with underwater entrances. And muskrats even eat cattails. Cattails also had a lot of Native American uses. They were used as a food source. The inner part of the root could be eaten raw. They roasted them. They could also be ground into a flour. They could weave mats out of the leaves, the nice flat leaves, and the fluff of the seeds was used as baby diapers. So the actual cattail structure that this plant is named for is the seeds of the plant. They have tiny little seeds attached to this fluff that helps them disperse away by wind and water from the parent plants. Wow. One plant certainly produces a lot of seeds. Cattails do a really interesting thing. They actually have big air spaces in their roots called parenchyma, and a lot of wetland plants do have parenchyma because their roots are underwater and they need oxygen in order to survive. So a lot of wetland plants actually pump oxygen down into their roots, into these spaces. And cattails and other wetland vegetation often release oxygen then out of their roots into the soil. Often, if you crack open a wetland soil sample, you'll see red lines that are called oxidized rhizospheres. And these are simply the areas surrounding a root where the oxygen released by the root into the soil has caused any iron in the soil to oxidize, and so you get that reddish color. And again, this is very, very commonly found in a wetland soil. There is some experimental evidence that cattails are actually supplying enough oxygen in the soil that they're actually facilitating or helping other plant species, such as forget-me-nots and willows. These are two native plant species that at least experimentally seem to be benefiting from the oxygen supplied by cattails. There are other obligate wetland plant species out here. Obligate meaning they absolutely need this saturated soil to live. There are a lot of sedges and rushes, and they are grass-like plants, but they're not grasses. Sedges have edges and rushes around. This is a rush, and this is the common rush, also called soft rush, Juncus effusus. And this is its flowering structure right here. So this is last year's flowering structure. And even though it looks like a grass, it's not. It's a grass-like plant. Rushes are round. So these are nice round stems. This is a classic sedge clump, and most sedges are obligate wetland species. They absolutely need to be in the water or in saturated soil. And these leaves are quite different from the rush leaves we saw earlier because sedges have edges. And this sedge will bloom later in the summer. There aren't any of last year's blooms, unfortunately, but they're really unique in that they have a male tassel, the staminate tassel, above the pistillate or female flower. All of these obligate wetland plants are providing some function, at least, in some uptake of pollution. Some of that is actually being biochemically broken down. And in addition to that, again, the surface runoff is slowing down when it's hitting these stems and when it's sitting here imponded. Although algae is photosynthetic, it's not technically a plant. It's in the kingdom Protista, so it's not a plant or an animal. And the predominant algae species that lives in this pond is Spirogyra, and it's named for its spiral-shaped chloroplast. And that's what actually holds the chlorophyll and does the photosynthesis. And you see this spiral-shaped chloroplast when you're looking at this under a microscope. Quite beautiful. Duckweed is a tiny little flowering plant, and it has these little floating leaves. Their flowers are almost impossible to see. They're so small. Now, the interesting thing about duckweed is that it actually does get caught on the feet of waterfowl, the feet and feathers of waterfowl, and is transported from pond to pond, wetland to wetland, so that it's really all over the place. We have a woods rose here, a wild rose, and you can still see the rose hips, the red rose hips, which are the fruit from last fall. They've actually overwintered, and these rose hips are an excellent food source. Mammals, and that includes people, and birds do love to eat them, and they're very high in vitamins, including vitamin C. These plants not only provide a good food source, but there are a number of bird species, such as goldfinches, that apparently even nest in them. Another thing I wanted to point out here is the willow, and this is a salic species, but willow is very, very flexible, which helps it survive floods. That's because it bends, it doesn't break, and the network of roots in the soil holds it in, stabilizes stream banks, and in the bark of the willow is salicylic acid, which is the same chemical compound found in aspirin. Behind us are some cottonwood trees, and these are a wonderful riparian species. It's the black cottonwood, Populus trichocarpa, and cottonwoods are fantastic in terms of habitat. They provide not only great nest cavity sites for woodpeckers and the other songbirds that use old woodpecker nest cavities, but also I've seen lots of different species of birds foraging for insect and insect larval food in the bark. And cottonwoods are also a very important riparian species because, again, they help stabilize the stream bank. They have a really interesting life cycle in that in order for the seeds to germinate and then establish, they actually need open areas. So that's often a sand or a gravel bar that's been exposed by a flooding event. So we do need these floods. They're regular disturbances that are important parts of wetland and riparian systems. So they need lots of moisture and lots of sunlight. They're very shade intolerant. And they're little teeny weeny seeds that float off on the water and in the air on their cotton. That's how they get their name, the fluffy cottony seeds. When we do a lot of things that control flooding, that prevent flooding, then basically the cottonwoods are no longer able to establish. So you have mature cottonwoods in some areas with no juveniles that will eventually replace them. And also, they really are poor competitors because they're so shade intolerant. And invasive species have shaded them out in some places. Macro means big, and an invertebrate is an animal that doesn't have a backbone.
Yep.
So that's what you're going to tell everybody, that these are all macro invertebrates, and you're going to tell them that lots of insects and other invertebrates like aquatic worms live in the water, and they're excellent food for fish and muskrats and other things.
Bugs. You gotta love them. Hi, my name is Francis Wigan. I'm a volunteer with the Watershed Education Network. We're on the shores of the Bancroft Pond in Missoula, and I'm here to introduce to you some of my AMI friends. What's AMI? AMI stands for Aquatic Macro Invertebrates. These animals are aquatic because they live most or all of their lives in the water or on the water. Macro because you can see them without using a microscope, although a hand lens sometimes will help. Invertebrates because none of these critters have a backbone. Well, if you were to make a list of all the species of animals, macroinvertebrates makes up 96% of that list. Arthropods, the segmented-legged animals, makes up 83%. And insects would make up 71% of that list of species. That means that of all the species of animals in the world, 7 out of 10 of those species are just insects alone. I know of no better way of determining the health of a body of water than by looking at what lives in it, on it, and depends on it so so much as the aquatic insects do. Anything that goes into the water or happens to that habitat affects them first. They are what we would call indicators of the health of a stream, or in this case, a pond. You will find amies everywhere in all types of water conditions, but not the same type of amies in all conditions. With that in mind, why don't we go on a subaqueous safari? I've got my hat, I've got my waders on, and I've got my net. So come join me and we'll see what we can find. First thing before even getting into the water is to take a look around and see, if I were an insect, where would I be? Would I be in the algae? Would I be in the vegetation along the side? I see water skippers on top of the water. Look into the water and enjoy what life you can see from the outside before you get in. So let's go ahead and jump in and see what we can find. On a pond, what I like to do is sample near the vegetation, not the bottom, but the vegetation area. I'm going to sample around those just by dragging my net by the vegetation. Let's see what kind of critters we get out of that. Let's go ahead and take this back to our table and look at some of the critters that live in this water. To sort the insects, we need some sort of container with water in order to put them back into the water. In this case, we're using an ice cube tray, and I've already added some water to it. With a spoon, I just reach into one or the other of these trays, find an interesting amy, and put her into different slots of the ice tray. Another method for collecting the insects out, especially the fast swimming ones, is to use this turkey baster. You can get close to the insect and actually suck them up into the turkey baster and then deposit them into the ice cube tray. So only for insects that are small, use the turkey baster. First one from the list of amies is the planaria. It's a very primitive flatworm. It has so-called a head, but really no brain. Its brain is its entire nervous system. It has a triangular shaped head. Most people would look at these and say, oh, they're leeches. No, they're flatworms. The next category of macroinvertebrate that I wanted to show you were the segmented worms. And we all have dug in our soil and found earthworms. Well, these are aquatic earthworms. These get their oxygen directly through their skin in the water itself. In a pond such as this, you'll find them down in the mud. And what do you think they eat? They'll eat the decaying vegetable matter that's down in that mud. The other segmented worm I found in here is the leech. It's a very small leech. Many people are afraid of leeches, no matter how small they are. But a leech this size, even though he might attach himself to you, could not possibly get through your skin. He probably goes after things like snails and slugs, things that have really soft bodies to them. Not a threat to humans. In this pond, in our sample that we collected, there were a lot of scuds. Scuds, like leeches, worms, planaria, they like slow water and decaying vegetation. Scuds are crustaceans, like the clams and the snails. Crayfish around here would be our largest one. Also in this pond, especially along the vegetation areas, you'll find water boatmen. These are true bugs, and they have a specialized legs that look like oars. These are air breathers. They need to come to the surface, grab a gulp of air, and use their legs to dive down. Whenever they get tired, run out of air, all they have to do is stop swimming, and they will automatically float back to the surface to get another gulp of air. These are predators also, going after almost anything alive that it can find in the water. Another Amy that I took from this water is the damselfly. This is the nymph phase of it. The damselfly and the dragonfly are the T-Rexes of the insect world. They consumed an awful lot of insects. They could catch insects on the fly. They're kind of like bats in that respect. The damselfly nymph, because it spends its time in the water, gets its oxygen from the water. And the three tails on the end are feathery, and those are the gills that the damselfly uses to breathe. The adult looks like this. If you've ever seen a dragonfly and a damselfly, the way you tell them apart, dragonflies, the adults, hold their wings out straight out all the time. They're heavier bodied. They usually have quite a large head. Damselflies, when they rest, will hold their wings straight back. They're a little more delicate in nature. Dragonflies, again, are really predaceous creatures. The nymph is quite an interesting creature in itself. It propels itself by squirting water out its backside, if you can imagine. That's the way it defends itself. That's the way it moves around. It takes in the water and then quickly expels it, which jet propels it around. It also has an adaptation that its lower jaw can come out and actually grab something. It can actually come out and grab small fish, and it can predate on even small vertebrate animals. You will find mayfly nymphs in Bancroft Pond. Bancroft Pond is fed by Paddy Canyon Creek, and so there is flowing water into the area, but you won't find the numbers. Whenever you have still water, you're going to have mosquitoes, and mosquitoes breed in still water. Their larvae will hang just at the surface of the water and pupate there and emerge as adults. Most of these critters we find in a pond do a lot of moving around. If you think of a pond, the water's still, there's a lot of algae in it, and it's probably quite warm as compared to streams. So you will find that there's less oxygen in the water. Water boatman, of course, has solved the problem of getting his oxygen by just coming to the surface of the water, but the rest of them that have gills or absorb oxygen through their skin need some other way of replenishing that oxygen supply, and most of the macroinvertebrates that you'll find in a pond tend to move around. They move around as part of being a predator and as a way of maximizing the water flow across their gills so that they can get oxygen. So who would be eating these kind of macroinvertebrates? The lower macroinvertebrates, some of them will only eat decaying material. Some will eat live vegetation. And the higher macroinvertebrates will eat those critters. And you could work your way up. What would eat the predators? Well, maybe the birds. Obviously fish. We know there are plenty of frogs in this pond, and the tadpoles. And bats probably fly by here by the hundreds at night, collecting whatever hatch comes off the water. It is interesting that even with the amount of pesticides and herbicides that are washing down Paddy Canyon and ultimately going through this Bancroft Pond, it is, to me, a little surprising that there are as many macroinvertebrates as there are, and with the amount of excrements from the ducks that are fed here time and time again. However, a large dump of a pesticide that would come down would surely wipe out a number of them. Heavy metals, chemicals that affect the skin especially these soft-bodied, the leeches, the flatworms, and the earthworms. They absorb everything through their skin, even the oxygen. So anything that goes into the water will ultimately affect them, which potentially could work its way up the food chain. Although these creatures, these macroinvertebrates, cannot do any harm to you, you could do a lot of harm to them. Remember, these creatures, their home is the water. And by taking them out of their aquatic habitat, you're taking on quite a large responsibility. You have to make sure that they have enough water so that they can breathe, enough food that they can eat. So it's always the best policy to take them out, look at them, and then return them back in. But if you do take them home or take them to your school as a project, make sure that there's plenty of oxygen in the water for them by using an aerator. Make sure that they have plant material or other macroinvertebrates if they're predators, so that they can continue to live out their macroinvertebrate lives. The only thing left is to return our friends back to their watery homes.
This would be great footage.
Are you getting him nibbling some of that algae too? Wow. Keep going. Look how fat he looks, fat and sassy.
There's 4 species that breed in this region that are native and 1 that's non-native. One species we frequently find here is the Columbia spotted frog. And the 3 other species that are native to this region are the western or boreal toad, the Pacific tree frog, and the long-toed salamander. And the non-native species that we find in this area is the bullfrog, which was introduced from the eastern United States and is actually a major predator of some of the native amphibians and other native biota we have in this area. Amphibians are an important part of wetland ecosystems because they are both predator and prey. As they're in this egg and tadpole stage, they are eaten by many predators, and even as juveniles and adult, they're eaten by birds and mammals, coyotes, things like that. But they're also important predators, and they eat invertebrates, and some of the larger animals will even eat things like fish and small mammals and birds. Cattail corner is less likely to have spotted frogs breeding. It's more choked with cattails, and although cattails are native, if they get so thick and there's not much open water, spotted frogs don't like to breed in that type of habitat. A place like Cattail Corner, what you'll find are Pacific tree frogs breeding. They tend to breed in diverse habitats, including fairly choked cattail areas. In an environment like this, you'll find Columbia spotted frogs, you'll find long-toed salamanders. It's okay to pick up adult frogs. They're pretty hardy. Be gentle with them. You can look at them and then release them back into the pond, and you're not going to hurt them. If you get your hands slightly wet, that'll help protect the slimy coat that they have on their skin. This is the Columbia spotted frog. The scientific name is Rana luteaventris, which luteaventris means yellow belly. And if you look on the belly of this frog, it's actually somewhat salmon colored or reddish on the legs. There's quite a bit of variation. The characteristics to identify this frog are the lip stripe, which is this tannish stripe that extends down the lip and ends at the end of the jaw. There's also some spots on the back, hence the name spotted frog. They're not very dark spots, but there's a light center and a dark ring, and they are irregular in shape. And then there's what are called dorsal lateral folds, or these little lines that come down on both sides of the back of the frog. They can tend to be a little bit goldish in color, and in the sun the frog will have a gold sheen to it. The spotted frog, the males typically emerge first, and they congregate at the preferred breeding areas. So they likely overwintered in these ponds or in the streams. And the males will emerge first and wait for the females to arrive. The females will come out of hibernation and move into the warmest parts of the pond to lay their eggs. And spotted frogs typically lay very large egg masses, upwards to 500 to 1,000 eggs per female, and it'll be laid in one mass. The eggs develop in about 2 to 3 weeks and then hatch out, and you usually have pretty high survivalship to hatching. There may be 5 to 10% that die as embryos, but the rest will make it to the tadpole stage, but it's very difficult to survive as a tadpole in these systems. There's so many predators, there's invertebrates that eat them, and snakes and birds and so forth. Typically for a single egg mass of 500 to 1,000 eggs, only about 5% of those will actually survive to make it through metamorphosis and become a small frog. The most difficult time is the tadpole stage and during metamorphosis. Metamorphosis from a tadpole to a small frog happens in typically August around here, and then the animals will have maybe 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the weather, to feed, and then they're going to go into hibernation and spend the rest of their time either underwater or at the edge of the water. And they hibernate in ponds, they hibernate in rivers and streams. Okay, this is the typical size of a Columbia spotted frog egg mass. This was laid probably about 4 days ago. And in real warm temperatures, the eggs can develop and hatch in about a week. It's been pretty cool, so these will probably take about 2, maybe even 3 weeks to hatch. And they start out as about a baseball-sized clutch of eggs. They have a jelly around each embryo, so each black dot is an individual egg. And then they're clustered together and stuck with this egg jelly. The egg jelly takes on water and the egg mass gets larger. And over time, you start to get some green algae, which is this greenish tint you're seeing to the egg mass. And over time, that green algae will help trap heat and help the eggs develop more quickly. As they mature, the tadpoles start to take shape. Here is just a section of one egg mass. And there are some individual tadpoles developing still inside their egg jellies. You can see them moving slightly. They have external gills when they're about this size, and by the time they hatch out, those gills start to recede and become an internal gill. And they're an important part of the ecosystem because they feed on the algae and small organic matter that are in the ponds. They're also important prey for a lot of animals that you find in this pond. You'll have fish that eat tadpoles. You'll have birds. See the size difference? This is an adult male in this hand, an adult female in this hand, and the male, when they mate, they go into amplexus, and the male will hop on the female, and then the female will actually carry the male around. That's how much stronger the females are. The male doesn't kick or anything; he just holds on, and then the female will carry the male around for 2 to 3 days before she's ready to lay her eggs. This female appears to be yolking up new eggs. She's quite fat. They'll develop the eggs throughout the season and through the winter, and then in the spring they'll be ready to lay again. This male, if you can see his toe, they have 4 digits on the front hand. The innermost digit is their thumb, and the male has a big black knob on it, the nuptial pad. That's how you tell a male, a sexually mature male, from a female. You can see the salmon on her belly. You see that? It extends right up to her armpit region, the axial region. She's quite light colored in here, and then that red salmon color. Yeah, she's pretty. After they go through metamorphosis, the frog is breathing air just like you and I. And yet, in the winter, it can go underwater, and it will change its circulatory system such that it's actually taking oxygen from the water through its skin and respiring back into the water through its skin. But it also is able to lower its metabolic rate very slow, so its heart beats very, very infrequently, and then it can come out in the spring and start breathing air. They're distinguished from a toad because they have somewhat moister skin. It's thinner skin. So here's a spotted frog tadpole, quite tan in color. And then on this side is a boreal toad tadpole. Toads are more terrestrial. They have a thicker skin, and they'll move up into the forest during dry days. So they require quite a bit of water, and they don't drink like a mammal. What they do is they soak water through their skin, and they have a patch on their belly, which is quite thin-skinned, and it enables them to pull water from the soil. The western toad lays strings of eggs, and what it'll look like is a string of pearls just twisted through the vegetation. One female will lay up to 20,000 eggs. The migration that you're seeing is typical of boreal toads. As one female will lay 20,000 eggs, just a few females can create a large number of tadpoles, and they'll form these migrating masses grouped together and move up and down the shoreline of the ponds. This is anti-predatory response, but it's also a thermoregulatory response. And what that means is their little black bodies, when they're grouped together like that, will trap a lot of heat, and they'll actually raise the water temperature in the water surrounding them, and that increases their growth rates. Also, if you're a predator coming down to pick off a tadpole, you're much more likely to survive if there's 10,000 of you in one spot than if there's one. The eggs were laid probably about 3 weeks ago, and probably in another week these guys will go through metamorphosis and leave the pond. They'll grow hind legs first, then front legs, and then their tail will absorb and they'll leave the pond as little toadlets. And only about 5% of all eggs that are laid will actually make it to become a juvenile toad. This guy is actually going through metamorphosis right now. Let's see if you see the hind legs. They're actually able to move the legs already. He's still a tadpole, but he's got little hind legs that he can kick with. And then the front legs develop under the skin, and in about a week you'd probably see that front leg moving around under the skin. Amphibians are known to be declining around the world right now, and there's many possible reasons why. Probably the number one reason is due to habitat destruction. And there's also some concern that there's diseases spreading around that are causing amphibian declines. There's also introduced predators like the bullfrog, which is introduced into this region as a major predator of native amphibians. Although the eggs are easy to find at this stage, they're also fairly sensitive to disturbance. Even just natural disturbance, such as ducks swimming by, can break apart the egg masses, and that somewhat decreases their chances of survival. But also you have animals like dogs and even children playing in the shallows of these wetlands, and that can break apart the egg masses as well. They're certainly most vulnerable in aquatic environments typically when they're in this egg or tadpole stage. Some of these eggs are laid in very, very shallow water, and as the water levels drop off, the developmental rate actually will increase, and the animals will try to get out of the water as fast as possible before the water body's dry. There's also high mortality from freezing in the spring, but in an urban setting like this, in an urban environment, you have other concerns. In some of these urban ponds, you have a very rapid filling because you have so much asphalt and firm, hard terrain in the area that the water runs off, and these ponds become essentially a stormwater storage area, and this can really influence the water levels, which can affect the developing embryos. Due to the surface runoff from streets and so forth, you're also carrying a lot of contaminants from the streets, such as petroleum products like oil and gasoline that form on pavement because of cars. You also have a lot of insecticides and herbicides placed on lawns to control weeds and to control pests that are unwanted. As nice as it is to have an urban pond, these animals face some stresses that other animals don't, that may occur in more pristine areas of mountains or protected areas. The most sensitive stage is certainly the egg and tadpole stage. Some pesticides will actually influence how they develop. And there's some evidence that pesticides play a role in amphibian abnormalities. It wouldn't be unreasonable to think that a frog would move from Cattail Corner to here, except we're in such an urban environment, it may be very difficult for a frog to move from Cattail Corner to here. Just the development in an urban area, such as all the development between here and Cattail Pond, that may become an isolation or a block for animals trying to get from one pond to another. And We call that fragmentation. In an urban environment, juvenile and adult frogs also face some hazardous situations, particularly in relation to cars. Typically on a rainy night, you'll get pretty significant migrations of salamanders, of frogs and toads, and a lot of animals die on the roads. One thing that we're finding out is some animals are introduced into small wetlands because people take a pet that they've bought at a pet store, they've had it a few years, and then over time they find that they don't want it anymore or can't take care of it. They take it out to a local pond and release it. And this creates a potential problem for two reasons. There are native species that are sold in pet stores, such as the Columbia spotted frog. If you released a captive spotted frog into this pond, it probably would survive. It also may breed with the native Columbia spotted frogs that occur in this pond. And you can actually disrupt the genetic uniqueness of this pond, and that can lose some of the local adaptations that the frogs have to this region, which helps them to survive. Another possible problem with pets is that they can carry diseases that would be a unique disease to this area and cause the local frogs to disappear. It's probably a bad idea to take animals from the pond, because eventually your mom's going to want you to bring it back and release it back at the pond, and you don't know how it's changed, what possibly diseases it's picked up, or it may become stressed and become sick because it's living in a jar or in an aquarium, and then you're bringing a sick animal back to the wild. So better just to leave animals in their native habitats and not move them around. We have a couple species of reptile that occur in these wetlands. The painted turtle is a native species to western Montana. We also have garter snakes in this region, the common garter snake and the wandering or western terrestrial garter snake. Garter snakes are adapted to live in along wetlands. They feed on fish, they feed on amphibians, and they are a major predator in these systems, and you'll often find them if you walk along the shoreline in the sun, particularly basking, or sometimes out in the water.
You'll tell everybody that all these birds flying around are the red-winged blackbirds. They have a black body, and they actually have red wing patches or badges used by the males as a territorial display. They're saying, hey, other males, stay off my territory, when they flash those red badges. Most people are probably aware of the red-winged blackbirds that are singing right now. One of the most common birds that you'll find at Bancroft Pond and Cattail Corner is the red-winged blackbird. These birds absolutely love the cattail habitat. These red-winged blackbirds not only eat parts of the cattail, but in addition to that, they build their nests down low in these cattail stems, so it's providing them excellent cover. In fact, it's really hard to see the mottled brown females down on the nests, but the males defending their territories are very visible. The black males are defending their territories by flashing those red badges on their shoulders. They migrate up in the spring, and the males establish little territories. The females, on the other hand, are very well camouflaged. They blend in to the cattails with their brown striped feathering. That's pretty good if you're going to be sitting on a nest and trying to avoid predators. The female and male will build the nest. The nests are very hard to see because they are down low in the cattails, very protected. That is their favorite habitat, but they will inhabit any kind of a marsh or swamp or shrubby wet area. Song sparrow, this is another really cool bird that's found out here at Cattail Corner in Bancroft Pond, and they also migrate. And this bird also establishes territories. So the male will defend his territory by going from the tops of shrubs in his territory from one to the other and singing. And they're very, very common. Their song starts out with a couple of introductory notes that are like hip, 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 and then it's very melodic, almost orchestral. Cowbirds are a real problem in general. They're a native bird, but they don't build their own nests. Cowbirds will come in and lay their eggs in another bird's nest. These are usually birds that are smaller than the cowbird is. And I'm sure that this happens to the red-winged blackbirds. The yellow warbler is a really common bird that's parasitized by the cowbird, and the song sparrow is. And so when the egg hatches, and the egg usually hatches sooner than the warblers or other small birds' eggs are going to hatch, the big cowbird chick actually kicks the other chicks and or the other eggs out of the nest and then gets the poor parent birds to feed it to the detriment of that bird's own babies. So again, having a very well camouflaged nest and being camouflaged on your nest is a really good thing, both to avoid predators and to avoid nest parasites like the brown-headed cowbird. Mallards are probably one of our most common ducks, and they're found all over the country. They are dabbling ducks and tip their butts up in the air, and they're foraging on aquatic vegetation, just as coots are, which you also find at Bancroft Pond and Cattail Corner. The clutch size of a mallard duck is pretty variable, usually around 5, 6, or more ducklings per couple. And mallard ducks actually do pair bond, and Canada geese do as well. They're attracted to the wetlands not only because they're adapted to using a watery habitat, but also because it's such a great food source, and there's a huge pulse or flush of food available during the summer when they're breeding. So Canada geese and mallards do both pair bond, or for the most part breed for life. Canada geese are not very picky about where they'll nest, but in an urban situation like Bancroft Pond, with so much traffic around the pond, it's probably important to have a nest platform for them. A nesting platform in the middle of the pond is a very safe nesting spot for a bird like the Canada goose. But typically, they'll just make their nests, on the ground, all around the borders of a pond or a wetland. Basically, with any of these birds that are breeding in a wetland, the babies are going to grow, from our perspective, remarkably quickly, because they do have to fledge and be ready to migrate or be ready to make it through the winter by the time fall rolls around. Mallard ducks are sexually dimorphic in terms of their plumage, and what that means is that the male and female ducks look different. The male ducks have very bright plumage. They have the bright green head, whereas the female ducks are really well camouflaged, as are the female red-winged blackbirds, again, for the same purpose, being hidden on the nest. All birds do have to molt their feathers. This means they lose their old, worn-out feathers and grow in new feathers. Now for a duck like the mallard, he has a drab set of plumage and then a breeding set of plumage, the really brightly colored, fancy plumage. Some birds lose enough of their flight feathers while they're molting at a time that they're not going to be able to fly and are very, very vulnerable to predators. Mallard ducks do lose all of their feathers while they're molting in its eclipse plumage, and they are very vulnerable to predation while they're growing in their new feathers. Believe it or not, coots are not ducks. They look like ducks, but they're not. But they actually dive for aquatic vegetation. Great blue herons are going to visit relatively frequently just because this is an excellent place to forage. And they stalk their prey. They're very long-legged and they carefully move around the sides of the pond and then grab their prey with their long, sharp beak. And this could be a frog or a tadpole. It could even be a rodent like a vole or a mouse. And they'll also eat fish. That's probably one of the most common prey items. Great blue herons don't roost at Cattail Corner and Bancroft Pond, but they do roost in communal rookeries nearby, just down the Bitterroot Valley along the river. Another bird that is present at Bancroft Pond is the northern flicker, and this is a woodpecker. There's a really nice nest box constructed here at Bancroft Pond for this bird. Again, they are cavity nesters. This type of woodpecker is very unusual in that they primarily feed off of ants, and so they feed on the ground. And that's very different than what you'd normally think of as woodpecker behavior. Very, very common birds though, really beautiful. Another visitor is the waxwing. There are both cedar and Bohemian waxwings that are present in this area. And what they do during the summer is to practice fly-catching behavior. They'll sit on a perch, fly out, grab an insect, and come back to the perch. They do not have to migrate in the winter because they are able to switch food sources, and they do eat berries that are left hanging on the trees during the winter. So we also have some invasive non-native birds that use this area. The house sparrow is a very common European bird that was introduced to the United States, and we call them invasive just because they are not native and they've really prospered for whatever reason. Another very common invasive bird is the European starling, and these birds do typically form very large flocks in the fall and winter. They're cavity nesters, and so among other things, they have kicked a lot of our native bluebirds and other cavity nesting birds out of their habitat. Wetlands are excellent habitat for not just mammals, but birds as well. And again, they're just such incredibly productive habitats. Lots of food, that's the main reason. Food, water, shelter, everything you want right there. One of the main sources of food is insects, and they migrate in general because there aren't very many insects available for them here in the winter. But there's a huge flush of food up here during the summer. So they take advantage of that when they're breeding. One of the problems with an urban wetland is that there is a lot of what we call edge. In other words, it's a very small natural area with lots of urban development around it, lots of edge area for predators like house cats, and even natural predators like raccoons and foxes to get into. So there's more exposure to the threat of depredation. It's a very good thing in general, obviously, for the female to be able to blend in and camouflage herself on her nest and to hide the nest inside the cattails or shrubs but it's especially important in a situation like this. One of the most important predators these days in an urban area is the house cat. This is a huge problem. House cats and feral cats kill literally billions of birds every year in North America, in the United States. And it's really, really important that you do your part by keeping your cats indoors. This is just an incredibly important thing to do to help prevent the depredation of our native birds. And actually, cats live about 3 to 5 years longer if they are kept indoors. Much safer for your kitty cat and much, much safer for our native birds. Another very popular activity at an urban wetland is feeding the wildlife. This is unfortunately not a good idea, even though it's very well intentioned. Some of the problems that can arise from feeding wildlife are, for one thing, our food is not very nutritionally sound for wildlife. Especially the sugar and the salt that's found in our food can actually be very harmful to the wildlife. Furthermore, when you feed the wildlife, they congregate in unnaturally large numbers frequently. For instance, you find very large populations of pigeons and ducks coming in for this food that wouldn't be sustained by the natural environment. And when they're found in really large numbers, they're more subject to diseases and parasites because they're in closer contact with one another. Also, large numbers of birds means a lot of excrement, and this is associated with diseases in some cases. Also, sometimes large numbers of waterfowl can spike the nitrogen levels in a pond to the point that there's a bloom of cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, and ironically enough, this can actually poison and kill the waterfowl that well-intentioned people are trying to help. Also, feeding these animals brings them nearer to roads where they can be hit by cars and exposes them to dogs and cats and other predators. So it's really, really important that we not let our pets run wild and that we not treat wildlife like pets. That is a muskrat home.
Right there.
Right there. Muskrats, this is what you're going to tell everybody. That pile of cattail stems is a muskrat's home.
Okay.
And muskrats use these cattail stems to build their homes.
Okay.
They're underwater entrances to that home, keeps them warm in the winter. The muskrat, that's a very, very common wetland mammal present here at Bancroft Pond. And this mammal is known for living in cattail marshes specifically, so it absolutely loves this habitat. It uses cattails to build little lodges. They're smaller than a beaver's lodge, and at the same time, they fulfill the functions that the beaver lodge does. They have their babies in there, and also they huddle there in the winter with other muskrats, and it stays just above freezing. The temperature doesn't vary very much over the course of the winter inside the lodge. In other words, the muskrat will be comfortable in there during the winter. It doesn't hibernate. Even when the temperature drops down very low at night, the temperature stays just above freezing for the most part. The entrances are underwater, even though the lodge itself is a platform above water, very well insulated. And the entrances are underwater so that they're not going to be apparent to their predators. So they feel extremely safe in there, in addition to being warm and protected from the elements. So muskrats do eat mostly vegetation. They will very rarely maybe eat some insects, but normally what they love to eat, again, is cattail, roots, and stems. But bulrush stems and roots will also do, and other wetland vegetation will suffice. Cattails, I think, are their favorite, though. They are rodents, and the beaver is also a rodent. Beavers, as far as I know, are not found here at Bancroft Pond, but they're all over the place in Montana. They're very, very common, and they're known for the large lodges that they make out of sticks and the dams that they make out of sticks. They eat the inner bark of trees. They particularly like cottonwood and aspen. The inner bark is where the plant has its sugar, the photosynthate that it's making in its leaves and sending down to the rest of the plant. So they're peeling away the outer bark and eating that sweet inner bark. And beavers, like muskrats, also do not hibernate in the winter. They stay awake and are quite warm and secure in those lodges where, again, they huddle communally. Another rodent that is really common in wetlands in Montana, and I'm sure it's found here at Bancroft Pond, is the meadow vole. And I absolutely love meadow voles. They're tiny little creatures, similar to mice, and they eat vegetation. That's all they eat. And in fact, they eat their body's weight in plants every single day. That's amazing to me. And they're very commonly found in places like this, and you can tell that they're here usually by runways through the tall grass. These little runways are just paths that they use to go back and forth when they're foraging for food. So meadow voles are active year-round, and they live in the subnivean habitat in the winter. That's underneath the snow. That's a very shallow layer between the ground and the bottom of the snow. And that does also stay usually a couple of degrees above freezing because it's protected from the outside air. And they huddle together communally in the winter, even though they're solitary usually in the summer, again for warmth. They don't stockpile food like the beaver does during the winter. So they're continuing to use those little runways under the snow in the winter to forage for any vegetation that's left over. They'll also eat fungus in the winter and seeds, probably even a few grubs, even though for the most part they are herbivores. Meadow voles are on everybody's menu, and they love tall grass because it helps them hide from their predators. So those runways that they make are little paths that they can take through the tall grass while they're foraging and hopefully stay under cover. And in fact, most meadow voles don't live past 8 or 9 months because somebody's eaten them by then. They're probably not very long-lived in the end anyway, though. Any of the raptors that are passing through would absolutely love to have a meadow vole for a snack. A specific feature here at Bancroft Pond is our Columbian ground squirrel population, and they occupy the adjacent upland area. They're a true hibernator. What that means is that they lower their body temperatures down to just above freezing. Now, they don't want to freeze, so they bury themselves down deep enough in their tunnels that they're going to be in a place that's going to stay just above freezing, even when it's very, very cold outside. So again, they want to be in a place where the temperature's not going to fluctuate. And so their metabolic processes are slowed way, way down. Their heartbeat is very, very slow. And they're basically in a state of suspended animation throughout the winter. Columbian ground squirrels up in Glacier Park are only going to be awake and active for a couple of months during the year, 2 or 3 months. Down at this elevation and near a wetland area in Missoula, they're going to be active a lot longer. A telltale sign that you have Columbian ground squirrels in the area is not only the holes in the ground where their burrow entrances are, and they do have more than one entrance to every burrow, but the dirt that they excavate out of these burrows is mounded up all over the place. They will live in a wide variety of habitats, and I don't specifically associate them with wetlands. They won't be in the wetland soil itself because the water table is so high. So they'll be in areas adjacent to wetlands and anywhere else, really. Animals that live here are not burrowing in the ground. For instance, the meadow voles' nests are above ground nests in the tall grass, and in the winter then they're under the snow. And then the muskrat and the beaver build lodges where the platform is above the level of the water, but the entrances are underneath. Wetland is prime mosquito habitat, so there definitely would be bats using this habitat. In fact, I've seen them here. Predominantly the little brown bat. Bats are flying mammals, very, very cool. And I think a bat is a wonderful thing to have around any cabin or house because they take out an inordinate number of mosquitoes. That's one of the main things that they eat. They absolutely love to dart around at dusk and throughout the night, picking these flying insects out of the air. They're in the order Chiroptera, which means hand wing. And the really cool thing about a bat's wing is that if you look at the bones, they are analogous to the bones in our hand, except that if we were bats, our fingers would be probably 6 feet long. Bats use echolocation in order to locate their insect prey very, very accurately. We can't hear their echolocation. They also do roost communally, and they hibernate in the winter. Their food is not available in the winter. So any animal that is hibernating in the winter is doing so because its food source is not available in the winter. And if there's any way that the animal can make it through the winter, if its food source is available, it's going to do that. And then an alternative to hibernating, if your food source is not available, is of course migration. Another couple of mammals that I wanted to talk about that are commonly found in Montana riparian areas and might be through here, because I do see them in urban areas, are the red fox and the raccoon. And both of these animals are carnivores. They're in the carnivora, but they're omnivorous animals, meaning they'll eat just about anything. I think that a vole would be on both the red foxes and the raccoons menu. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there were raccoons and foxes in the area, or at least passing through. Foxes and raccoons have typically, even back on the East Coast, adapted very well to suburban living. I'm sure that you guys know also that there are a lot of white-tailed deer and mule deer that use Mount Sentinel, and that's another mammal that will be passing through frequently, especially in the winter. They come down lower in the winter to avoid the snowpack. That's when I've mostly seen them come through this area. Fox squirrels are an invasive species from the East Coast, but out here, these invasive fox squirrels have absolutely taken over the suburban and urban environment that is Missoula, and have wreaked havoc on the poor little pine squirrel habitats. Basically, they outcompete pine squirrels in this range. Now, pine squirrels were never specifically associated with wetlands. However, there were a lot of pine squirrels historically in Missoula taking advantage of this habitat, and they've been outcompeted in this range by the fox squirrel, an invasive species. I think all the species that I've mentioned do actually move around quite a bit. They disperse, in other words. Even voles, believe it or not, these little voles can disperse fairly well. A wetland area like Bancroft Pond would definitely attract a lot of species to it because this habitat is fairly rich. I mean, a wetland habitat in general, not this one in particular. And a good food source. Again, food, water, and shelter are abundant here compared to the rest of the suburban environment, except of course where people leave out their garbage and dog food. We are going to talk about all of the threats to clean water. Soil gets washed into the water. So we have a housing development and people put all kinds of things on their lawns, and the rainwater washes all that pesticide and fertilizer into the water. So you're going to tell everybody that. Okay. From roads and parking lots, what kind of stuff washes off?
Oil and grease.
Oil and gas and grease, right. Okay, good job. This is called a Canada thistle, and it is not a native plant to Montana. It's a weed. And can you tell us about some of the problems that weeds are causing? In other words, they get into an area like this where they're not native.
Yeah, and then they drink all the water.
They drink all the water, they take over, and they often outcompete, they boot out the native plants. We also have our fourth indicator species of wetlands right down there on the base of that rose bush. It is trash. You are going to tell everybody that wetlands are wonders worth saving because they do so many things for us, especially their excellent habitat. All kinds of plants and animals use wetlands. So you're going to say that wetlands provide food, water, and shelter for lots of our animals like muskrats and frogs and turtles and blackbirds.
Okay.
Okay, you want to call for your first students? I'm Wendy from the Montana Natural History Center, and we also have some people volunteering for the Natural History Center and from Save Open Space. And you guys are going to improve wetland habitat today by taking out weeds, replacing them with native plants, and we're also going to do a little wetlands ecology talk. So I have a question for you guys. Does anybody know, raise your hand if you know, what some of the things are that wetlands are good for? Right here.
Me?
Yep.
Plant animals can go in there and.
Good. Plants and animals. And what's that called? Is it habitat? Wetlands are excellent habitat. 80% of the animals in North America, that's most of our animals, have to use wetlands either their entire lives or at some point during their lives, like when they're babies. Wetlands only make up about 1% of our land area. That's not very much, is it? So are wetlands really important habitat?
Yeah.
Do they clean up our water, anybody?
Yes.
How do wetlands do that?
I think they take water in.
They do. They take stormwater in. So when all that water is running off the land after a rainstorm, it goes into a wetland if we have wetlands and not directly into the river or stream. Would we have lots of big, huge floods if all the water rushed right into the rivers and streams?
Yeah.
You're right. The wetlands hold on to that water and they release it slowly. So in August, when it's really dry out, they're like sponges. They're holding that water and they're still releasing it. And they clean up our water. Do you think the water running off that parking lot might be dirty?
Yeah.
What might it have in it?
Dirt.
Dirt?
Oil.
Oil and gas? Excellent. And the wetland actually filters out some of that pollution. What about from the houses up there? What kind of stuff runs off of lawns when it rains?
Like a whole bunch of mud.
Mud and
Fertilizer.
fertilizers and pesticides. Excellent, you guys. And that stuff ends up in the wetland, and you know what? It settles out. Or the plants actually take it up so that the water leaving the wetland and going into our rivers and streams is cleaner. Wow. Excellent job.
Have drinks now and
I don't know. Good job, you guys. Wow. Right on. Wetlands are an amazing habitat here in Montana and throughout the world. Wetlands provide plenty of food, water, and shelter. So the entire food web is present here in the wetland. I just think that wetlands are an incredibly rich habitat. Of course, All of these animals and plants are dependent on each other for their existence. A wetland is a great place for kids to come and study these food web interactions and just to learn about conservation of natural resources and to learn about the things that wetlands do for us. So do keep in mind when you visit a wetland habitat that this is habitat or home for lots of plants and animals. So treat them with respect, treat them with care, and think about how you would like somebody visiting your home to treat you and to treat your home. I think that you'll come away learning a lot and having a good time.